and welcome back to another Hallowoods weekly Q&A. Apologies for the camera setup troubles here as we get situated. I, like a klutz, have just knocked everything over. There we are. Excellent. Thank you. So, welcome back to another weekly Q&A live stream. If this is your first one, well, hello. If you are watching in the present day, there is a YouTube chat that you can click over to and access. And that chat allows you to drop questions and commentary during the feed, and I will respond to any questions that pop up there as best I can. In addition to that, we do have a patrons ask box that patrons can access if they look at the post in Patreon. And that allows you to drop questions in advance that I try to answer week to week as well. If you're watching this in the far future, this Q&A has come and gone, but there are probably others happening sometime that you can drop questions for and get answers to. That said, this has been at this point, really, most of the show work is just chipping ahead on these next few episodes, and especially beginning to try and get a bit of a backlog going when it comes to working on the show, since there's a lot of things on the burner, and especially behind the scenes, I will be on a bit of a vacation down to the US of A during August. So I'll be trying to get a relay of episodes set up in advance, so that hopefully there's no interruptions on this end while I am out of town and away from my desk. So I'll be chipping away on that over the next little while. In addition to that, as you might have seen over the last week or so, I will be taking up a sort of partial pastime of mine, which is running RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. And I will be doing that for a bit of a public audience as well. People now have the chance to hire me as a dungeon master, as they call them, someone who runs the game. And so in addition to being available for like personal events and kind of one-off adventures for a small group, I will also have several ongoing sort of weekly campaigns that people can join. They are mostly booked up at this point, shockingly, surprisingly, and blessedly. But, keep an eye out as seats might open up at various times. I'll post about it when it happens. Or I might open up other events or other games, as time goes on. So that will be kind of a fun new installation for me to work on, but definitely an added sort of creative outlet to manage from week to week. But I think the show itself is in a good place now where I can kind of work on a couple of these different projects at the same time. And that should also help just tide over basic expenses when it comes to affording food and covering the cost of making the show and all these different things. So hopefully it's a good outlet for that. In the meantime, we do have a couple questions in the patron ask box, and after that, I will circle over to the chat itself. So feel free to drop questions in, and I'll get to them in a couple minutes if that's the case. So to start with, we had a question from last week that I had missed in the chat, and that was a question around if my characters listened to audio drama, which audio drama would they listen to? Now, the funny thing is that I haven't necessarily listened to all of the different favorites that people tend to have tuned into. My exposure to them is somewhat limited, but I would say probably Olivier's Song would be a Penumbra podcast listener. That one seems to be fairly erudite and have kind of bookish schemes going on. I think Diggory Graves could probably get into Death by Dying or maybe Wooden Overcoats for just pleasant listening. Wooden Overcoats might be more of a Walt show, actually, come to think of it. I could definitely pencil in maybe Friday for the Magnus Archives. She has a certain amount of edginess that I associate with that fandom. I think Nicky Nick, possibly a Welcome to Night Vale listener, just for obvious vibes reasons. I think we could definitely get Clementine in on Malevolent. That sounds about right. Though that might be kind of a Shelby show. Maybe they listen together from time to time, which makes it very slow listening. And we can pencil the Mendes down for Jar of Rebuke. Just seems like that peaceful, somewhat occult vibes would sound about right. So that's a couple of responses there. For our actual Q&A box this week, we have 2 questions in the box. One from Leech. Leech asks, I find that when I attempt my own original writing, I run into roadblocks with dialogue. I'll be able to write a conversation to a point before coming up blank on things that real people would say, rather than just relaying information in a rigid, matter-of-fact structure. Is this an issue you have ever faced, and if so, how do you deal with it? I would say yes. My ability to write dialogue has, I can't, I can't from the inside say whether it's any good, but it's certainly better than it used to be. I think when I first got into writing dialogue was one of my bigger struggles. It was often a question of like trying to find. It eluded me how to write dialogue that sounded like what an actual person would say. It often was kind of wooden or like purely just expositing plot information. Everyone kind of acted like a video game NPC where all they're around to say is like, and then in the 7th layer of the king's dungeon, you will find, etc., etc., etc. So there were a couple things that helped me get a better grasp on how to write those kinds of conversations. And it just took a lot of practice and a lot of working on various projects to try and hone that better. I think a couple of things that kind of lent to that eventually is that I try to really put myself into the conversation when it comes to an interchange between 2 characters. I'm usually often like reading those lines aloud. I want to make sure that it sounds right when people say it. And if it doesn't sound right, then I'll go back and I'll rewrite what they're trying to say until it sounds more like something a human might try to address. Similarly, I find that putting yourself in the shoes of that character, trying to look through their eyes a little bit, trying to envision how they're feeling, what they believe, who they are in this conversation, and trying to really embody their mindset for a moment while you're writing their dialogue, rather than kind of like sitting on the outside writing an exchange between 2 objects. That's just kind of a mindset shift that I've noticed as I write dialogue now versus how I used to write dialogue. I would also say there's many things I could say on this topic. Another is that I try to think about what each character, how they express themselves. Different characters carry themselves differently. They use different language. They use different mannerisms of language. Lady Ethel Mallory talks like no one talks in real life. She talks like a kind of like a marketing professor. She, she is constantly giving monologues like a diva in front of a mirror, like reciting her own performances. No one talks like this in real life, but there is a certain cadence to the way that she speaks and the way that she performs. And so when she is talking with someone else and having a real conversation with them, there is this performative aspect to it where she is putting on this effect. She is talking in a specific and exaggerated way as it corresponds with her image that she wants to present. And so when Lady Ethel Mallory is giving or like distributing information, she's going to do it in her own particular way, in a way that tracks with how her character does things, rather than just in an objective way. She doesn't like say, hi there. She says, hello, And so keeping an eye out for those mannerisms, those nuances of the character, sometimes that helps speed along the dialogue process, where you are no longer just providing the information, but you're providing it with the voice of that character. And often the way that they portray words will change the outcome of the conversation a little bit. Selkie in the chat says, word choice is also important for dialogue. A character from a rural area probably isn't saying things the same way as a big city socialite. 100%. There's even in the Hallowoods, like there's examples of this, especially Fort Freedom's various characters tend to be, some of them, especially Rick, tends to be a little bit more westernized, a little bit more, as they say, yeehaw. He's got, Rick says howdy, whereas characters like Nicky Nick have specific language uses as well. Nicky Nick rarely, I think, comparatively uses contractions. He spells out a lot of his words. He enunciates things in kind of this more lengthy, dramatic Shakespearean way, or he wishes. He is the sort of way that two characters will construct sentences is going to vary, and that can also sway the outcome of that information. If Buck is trying to talk about how like the world has changed over the last few years, it's going to sound different than the way that Diggory would present it. Buck being a little bit more down to earth and contracted and using turns of phrase, and Diggory being much more sort of polite and slow and methodical in their word choices, and probably a little bit more poetic. So again, all of these are ways, not only in the word choice, but sometimes, and this is probably the last like piece of that, that a character, and I think maybe the most important piece when it comes to making exposition not sound like exposition, don't tell us the truth when a character is speaking. Very few characters should ever tell the objective truth about what is going on in the world. Maybe a seer, maybe like Galadriel's voice at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. There's something in the water. But otherwise, almost every person that you write has been down on the ground experiencing a particular version of reality. They might view things completely differently than other characters do about the same circumstances. For instance, Fort Freedom views the Black Rains as kind of a plague upon humanity. The Scout Post regards them with caution, but also with an increasing sense of kind of trust and hope. The Knights of St. Lawrence that we've just been introduced to regard the Black Rains as sort of a purifying wave of sort of revelatory fire from God. And so each of these three groups, if you talk to any people from these cultures, each one of them is going to tell you a completely different version of the exposition about what the Black Rains are. And so this is probably one of the better ways to stop your dialogue from feeling like just a dump of information, because it tells us something about the character if we learn not only what might be at play in the plot, but what they think of what's going on in the plot, how they feel about what's going on in the plot. I look over to like, we'll take some examples from like Star Wars. We get perspectives from a couple of different people that are like down on the ground during, say, the takeover of the Empire as it sort of sets itself up and takes over the galaxy. And some of those people, the Rebel Alliance group are like, this Empire is the worst. This is, a totalist regime. This is a corrupt political machination. It all needs to burn down. We need to take down this huge threat. But other people that we encounter throughout the galaxy see it, some of them as an opportunity. a shift in the power that's going to allow them to like make a big profit. We get a couple of those. There are people who, you know, are under the boot of the empire and they don't think they have any hope for like an ability to escape that. Their position is that they are kind of hopeless about the situation. And then there are people that believe it is a purifying agent that is cleansing an old corrupt government and installing something much more orderly and concise in its place. So again, if you ask any of these people about what the empire is in your universe, you're going to get drastically different responses from each of these groups of characters. So that is one of the things that I look to when it comes to information about the world. Um, I have also grotesquely cheated on exposition in this show, because all throughout the first few seasons of Hello from the Hallowoods, in addition to what's going on in the world, and in addition to the actual like down on the ground perspectives that we get, Nick is there to hover over and give us a still rose tinted, but a more topical exploration of what the world looks like. In particular, I think his perspective is still biased. What is beautiful to him about the Black Rains is also probably what is horrifying about it to the people that live through it. But that said, you know, he does provide a little bit of extra narration from this hovering overhead omnipresence that we usually don't get with these types of stories. So those are some thoughts on how to get around when it comes to stilted exposition dialogue. Um, I think probably a last question, and this is more of like a generic writing tip that people suggest online from time to time, is try to figure out what your characters want out of that conversation, because often I think what happens is it's easy to connect two characters and have the goal just be that we learn some information. Um, and I think it's important to keep, if we're going to try and get away from just our protagonist patiently listening while Brahm the Elderly explains the history of the great dragon riders and their fallen order. Um, if we're going to try and get beyond that, then we should look to two things. And one is what our character wants out of this conversation. Beyond just the information, what is the information going towards? What are they going to use this for? Is there something that they need or that they want from this person beyond this conversation? Um, you know, I think over to like, again, I hate to draw more Star Wars comparisons, but it's easy pop culture reference. You know, Luke gets that initial conversation with Obi-Wan Kenobi in their little desert hut, over milk. And in addition to just getting information about his father, about his, you know, the life story, and a little bit more about what the Jedi are. In addition to that, Luke wants to. He kind of gets this inspiration in that moment where he wants to be a Jedi. He wants Obi-Wan to teach him stuff that goes beyond just that conversation. He wants more out of this relationship. So knowing what your character wants, how are they going to push forward in that conversation to try and get that? And similarly, the character giving the exposition, in addition to having their own flawed view of what they're talking about, they might also want something out of that conversation. And hopefully that sets you up where instead of just one person passively listening and one person sharing a bunch of plot information, you have two dynamic people that are positioning throughout the conversation to get what they want. So those are some things I look out for. We do have a second question from Leech, and then I'll move on to any questions that we've got in the chat. Leach asks, what made you decide on 14 years for the time skip rather than the symbolic 13 or a more rounded 15? Or was it just a random number? I'll be honest. It's partially due to two things. 14 put a lot of characters at an age that I wanted to write them about. without putting them sort of too far along the line. A lot of people that are part of the story, and apologies for spoilers as we have already transgressed in this question. More to come for season 4 slightly, so audience beware. But when it comes to the kind of gap of time that we've spanned, 14 put us a lot closer to it coincided nicely for the math for a lot of characters, for kind of the stage of life that I wanted to write about them in this like next installment. But on top of that, because Hello from the Hallowoods starts in 2050, in like the autumn or winter of 2050. However, by the time that the winter passes, and that is, I think, where we see Diggory begin to walk. Uretzi begins her hunt for Apollyon. However, by the time that most of the story really happens, by the time that like Diggory and Percy start to work on their relationship, by the time that Apollyon, Mort, and Uretzi come together, by the time these things happen, it's spring of 2051. And then the events of the first season unfold over the spring, the events of the second season unfold over the summer, and the events of the third season unfold over the winter. And that really brings us to either the end of 2021 or the very, very beginning of 2022 when it comes to where the third season ends. 2052, sorry, which means that a time jump of 14 years puts us squarely at 2065 in the like modern timeline, which works out conveniently when it comes to like figuring out all the dates. It makes a lot of the math easier when I'm like calculating world events. So lining it up nicely with 2065 was one of the considerations as well. Just to make the timeline a little bit more convenient on my end. So that was probably part of the math as well. We'll move on to questions in the chat itself. So that said, Fort Freedom Southernisms are so good. I'm glad. I enjoy those folks. I miss a couple of them. We've run short and or haven't checked in with a number of people from the Fort Freedom side in our current day and age. For Archie S. Kelly, you mentioned in another live stream that you now live in a small city called Halifax. Is that in Nova Scotia? It is in Nova Scotia. It's a lovely little sort of maritime city. Cold, but mostly rainy and foggy throughout the winters. And then very pleasant summers, as we're beginning to see unfold over here. I would dare say this is the first week of summer, really, that we've ended up with. But that said, if that is the end of our questions for now, then that might bring us to the end of our stream. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. And I'll be happy to catch you all in a live stream coming up sometime soon. Until then, take care and see you around the bend. Toodles.